They thought a 10-foot steel fence could trap me on my own land. For 30 years, this ranch wasn't just my home, it was my entire world, a legacy I had carved out of nothing. But the new HOA board saw it differently. They saw my property as an obstacle, a loose end they needed to control. So, using a forgotten clause in their bylaws, they did the unthinkable. They built a wall, cutting off my only access to the outside world, leaving me isolated and surrounded. They believed I was powerless, a prisoner on my own property. But they made one critical error in their plan, one small detail they completely overlooked. What happens when you give a man with nothing to lose control of the only gate for miles? For the better part of 40 years, my world was defined by the rising sun and the half-mile stretch of gravel road that connected my ranch to the rest of the world. My name is Arthur, and this land, tucked away in the rolling hills, was more than just property. It was a promise I had made to my late wife, Eleanor. We bought it when it was nothing but wild grass and stubborn trees, and together, we built our life here from the ground up. Every fence post was a memory, every barn beam a testament to a shared dream. After she was gone, the ranch became my sanctuary, a living breathing piece of her memory that I tended to with everything I had. My days were simple and followed a rhythm set by the seasons, not by a clock. I'd wake before dawn, the smell of coffee and old wood filling the small house we'd built. I'd mend fences, tend to the small herd of cattle that grazed in the southern pasture, and watch the hawks circle high overhead. The gravel road was my only companion on my trips to town, a familiar, dusty path that had served my family for generations. It was quiet, it was peaceful, and it was mine. That peace began to fray at the edges about 5 years ago. The sprawling empty land that bordered my ranch was sold to a developer. Within months, the distant hum of nature was replaced by the roar of bulldozers and the scream of power saws. A new community, grandly named the Meadows at Summit Ridge, began to rise from the dust. House after identical house sprouted up, each with a perfectly manicured lawn and a 2-car garage. They were beautiful, I suppose, in a sterile, manufactured way. The old gravel path that led to my ranch was paved over, widened, and became the main artery into this new suburban enclave. My property line ran parallel to this new road, an invisible border between my world of weathered wood and their world of pristine vinyl siding. I didn't mind at first. Progress was progress, and I was content to keep to myself. I was a relic, a holdover from a different time, and the new residents mostly ignored the old rancher at the end of their polished new street. I was just part of the scenery. The trouble started subtly, like a slow-leaking faucet. A glossy newsletter appeared in my mailbox, welcoming me to the jurisdiction of the Meadows Homeowners Association. I tossed it, assuming it was a mistake. My ranch was never part of their development. Then came the first official letter, printed on thick, expensive paper. It was a notice of violation. My old, reliable Ford pickup, parked near the edge of my property, was deemed an inoperable vehicle and an eyesore visible from their road. I was instructed to move it. I found the request absurd but complied, moving the truck behind the barn. A week later, another letter arrived. The grass along my fence line, which bordered their precious road, was 1/4 of an inch too high. It was a warning. The source of these notices was the newly elected HOA president, a woman named Carol Gable. She had moved from the city a year prior and carried herself with an air of unshakable authority. We met once when she'd walked up my road, clipboard in hand, to inform me that the rustic, hand-carved sign Eleanor had made for our ranch entrance was not in compliance with community aesthetic guidelines. She spoke in a calm, condescending tone that made it clear she wasn't having a conversation, she was issuing a decree. I saw in her eyes a deep-seated intolerance for anything that didn't fit her vision of perfect, orderly suburbia. My ranch, with its sprawling imperfection and rugged authenticity, was a stain on her masterpiece. I tried to explain that my property wasn't part of her HOA, that my deed was nearly a century old, but she just smiled a thin, dismissive smile and told me the developer had integrated all adjacent parcels into the community framework for legal and tax purposes. It was nonsense, but it was clear she believed it. The petty notices continued, a slow, relentless campaign of harassment. A violation for a visible compost pile. A warning about the color of my barn roof. I ignored most of them, and for a while, it seemed to quiet down. I thought perhaps she had grown tired of her little power game. But the silence was deceptive. It was the calm before a storm I never saw coming. One morning, I noticed two men in bright yellow vests driving stakes into the ground along the entire length of the road, just inches from my fence. They carried surveying equipment and worked with a quiet efficiency that sent a shiver down my spine. They weren't just measuring the road, they were marking a new boundary. A few days later, a certified letter arrived. It wasn't a violation notice this time. It was a formal declaration from the HOA's legal team. It was filled with dense legal jargon, but a few phrases stood out: perimeter security, unauthorized thoroughfare, and community enhancement project. The letter informed me that to ensure the safety and privacy of the residents of the meadows, the road would soon be designated a private drive, and a permanent boundary fence would be erected. I stood on my porch, rereading the letter as a cold dread washed over me. They weren't just putting up a fence. They were building a wall. And my ranch, my home, my entire world, was about to be on the wrong side of it. The day the fence was completed felt like a funeral. A 10-foot-tall monument of black steel now separated my ranch from the world, an imposing, sterile barrier that screamed of control and exclusion. The HOA had scheduled a small ribbon-cutting ceremony for Saturday morning to celebrate what they called the grand opening of the meadow's secure entrance. It was a party to commemorate my imprisonment, and the whole community was invited. I watched from my porch as they set up a small podium and tied a ridiculous oversized red bow to the gates. Carol Gable was in her element, dressed in a crisp white pantsuit, greeting residents with a triumphant smile. She was a queen christening the walls of her new fortress. I remained inside my house, out of sight. I'm sure they thought I was hiding, broken and defeated. But I wasn't defeated. I was waiting. I had spent the last 2 weeks, a ghost in my own life, preparing for this exact moment. Every legal document, every survey map, every word from my lawyer was etched into my memory. The trap wasn't the one they had built for me, it was the one they had blindly walked into themselves. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows from the bars of my cage, a small crowd gathered. Carol stepped up to the podium, her voice amplified by a small speaker, echoing across the manicured lawns. She spoke of safety, of community, of protecting property values. She painted a picture of a tranquil paradise, now shielded from the undesirable elements of the outside world, a thinly veiled reference to my ranch. As she spoke, a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Their attention was shifting from her speech to something just beside the gate. It was a small, rustic wooden booth, no bigger than a garden shed, that hadn't been there the day before. It was built of the same weathered timber as my barn, and a simple sign hung from its side, currently covered by a canvas sheet. Confusion turned to whispers. Where had it come from? What was it for? Carol, flustered by the loss of her audience, tried to regain control, her voice becoming sharper. She reached for the ceremonial scissors, ready to cut the ribbon and declare her project complete. That was my cue. I walked out of my front door and made my way steadily down the gravel path towards the gate. I wasn't wearing my usual dusty work clothes. I had on a clean, pressed shirt and my best boots. I moved with a purpose they had never seen from me before. The whispers stopped. Every eye was on me. Carol Gable froze, scissors in mid-air, a look of pure fury twisting her features. She thought I was coming to make a scene, to protest one last time. I ignored her completely. I walked directly to the new wooden booth, unlocked its door, and stepped inside. From there, I reached out and pulled the canvas sheet off the sign. In bold, clear letters, it read, Meadows Pass Toll Station. Access across private property. Fee, $50 per vehicle. Cash or card accepted. I then placed a modern, wireless credit card terminal on the booth's small counter. The silence that followed was profound, a vacuum of collective disbelief. It was broken by Carol, who let out something between a gasp and a shriek. "What is the meaning of this?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Have you lost your mind?" I leaned forward, my voice calm and even, letting the microphone from her podium pick up my words for everyone to hear. "Not at all, Carol. I've just found my entrepreneurial spirit." I held up a single, laminated document for all to see. It was a copy of the original 1928 survey of my property. "You see," I began, my voice carrying across the stunned crowd, "when your developer built this community, they were very thorough. But they missed something. A tiny little square of land, a 10-foot by 10-foot plot, right here." I pointed to the ground directly beneath the gate's primary electronic motor and the concrete slab where the keypad for entry was installed. An old surveying error from a century ago that was never corrected. It was part of my family's original parcel, and it was never sold. It's still mine. You've spent $250,000 building a beautiful, state-of-the-art electronic gate, directly on my private property. The implication settled over the crowd like a physical weight. I wasn't blocking their road, the HOA had done that for me. I was simply controlling access to the gate they had built on my land. Their faces shifted from confusion to anger, but the anger wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at Carol, whose face had gone from red to a pale, waxy white. "This is illegal. It's extortion," she sputtered, fumbling for her phone. "I'm calling the police. We'll have you arrested for trespassing." I simply smiled. "Actually, Carol, your gate is trespassing on my land. But I'm willing to overlook that, for a small fee. Think of it as a leasing agreement." She screamed into her phone, and within 10 minutes, 2 police cruisers rolled up to the scene, lights flashing. A traffic jam of annoyed residents was already beginning to form down the street, their Saturday plans now on hold. Carol rushed to the senior officer, a man named Sergeant Miller, who I knew from my trips into town. She launched into a frantic, hysterical tirade, pointing at me, the booth, and the sign, painting me as a deranged old man holding the entire neighborhood hostage. Miller listened with a patient, weary expression, then walked over to me. "Arthur," he said with a sigh, "what's all this about?" I didn't say a word. I simply handed him a thin file folder. Inside was the 1928 survey, my official, updated property deed registered with the county, a legal opinion from my lawyer citing relevant property and easement laws, and a receipt for the property taxes I'd been paying on that specific 10-foot square for the last 40 years. He spent several minutes reading through everything, his expression shifting from tired to intrigued. He walked over to the gate, looked at the survey marker still embedded in the grass, and traced the perimeter of the concrete slab with his boot. He then walked back to his car to make a call, presumably to the county clerk's office. The whole neighborhood watched in dead silence. After a few minutes, he returned, handing the folder back to me. He turned to face Carol, who stood with her arms crossed, expecting him to put me in handcuffs. "Ma'am," Sergeant Miller said, his voice firm and official, leaving no room for argument. "As far as I can tell, no crime is being committed here. This is a civil matter. According to the county's official records, Mr. Thompson does, in fact, own this small parcel of land. Your association built a structure on his property without his permission. He has every right to control who crosses his land and to charge for that access." Carol's jaw dropped. The color drained completely from her face as she stared, utterly defeated. The officer's words hung in the air, a public verdict on her arrogance and overreach. He looked past her at the line of waiting cars. "He's not breaking any laws," he announced to the residents. "But you are all currently trespassing." With that, he tipped his hat to me, got back in his cruiser, and drove away. The second officer followed, leaving Carol alone, stripped of her authority, surrounded by the angry glares of the very people she claimed to be protecting. I stood in my booth, the credit card machine humming softly, and looked out at the chaos she had created. The queen was dethroned, her fortress had become her prison, and I was the gatekeeper. The silence left by the departing police cruisers was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum filled with the wreckage of Carol Gable's authority. She stood frozen for a long moment, a statue of public humiliation, as the angry glares of her neighbors bored into her. The fortress she had built to protect them had become their cage, and I, the man she had tried to erase, was now the sole gatekeeper. The spell was broken. The first resident to approach the booth was a doctor who lived at the end of the street. His face was a mask of grim frustration. Without a word, he thrust his credit card at me. I swiped it, the machine chirped its approval, and a small receipt printed out. The sound, a tiny, mechanical whir, was the official confirmation of my victory. I handed him the receipt and pressed the button to open the gate. It swung open with a smooth, electronic hum, granting him passage. He drove through without a backward glance. One by one, others followed, a slow, resentful parade of luxury sedans and SUVs, each transaction a small surrender to the new reality. The chaos at the entrance to the meadows became the talk of the county. For the next week, I operated my toll booth with quiet diligence. I opened at sunrise and closed at sunset. I was unfailingly polite, wishing everyone a good day as I processed their payments. The HOA was in a state of total meltdown. They sent out frantic emails urging residents not to pay, advising them to use an old, unpaved service road that added 45 minutes to their commute. Most refused, choosing to pay the toll rather than navigate the muddy, potholed backroad. An emergency HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and from the shouts echoing across the lawn, it was clear that Carol's reign was over. She was facing a full-blown insurrection from the very people she had promised to lead. Her grand project, meant to solidify her power, had backfired so spectacularly that she had become a prisoner in her own home, her neighbors now viewing her with open contempt. Their lawyers sent me a barrage of cease and desist letters, filled with empty threats and legal posturing. They knew they had no ground to stand on. Their only option was to sue me for ownership of the land through adverse possession, a legal battle that would take years and cost a fortune, all while the residents continued to pay my daily toll. The financial and political pressure was immense. They were bleeding money and hemorrhaging credibility. Finally, on the 8th day, a delegation of 3 HOA board members, notably, without Carol, approached my booth, waving a white flag of truce. They looked exhausted and defeated. They tried everything. They appealed to my sense of decency, my community spirit. They offered to buy the small plot of land from me for a generous sum. I listened patiently, letting them finish, then shook my head. This was never about money, I told them, my voice even. This was about respect. You took away my peace, so I took away your access. You want the gate back. You want this to end. My terms are not negotiable. I slid a single sheet of paper out of the booth's window. On it were my 4 conditions. First, the HOA was to fund the complete and immediate removal of the entire fence they had constructed along my property line. Not just the gate, but every single post and panel. Second, Carol Gable was to issue a public, written apology to me for the harassment and immediately resign from her position as president and from the board entirely. Third, the HOA would pay all of my legal fees, a sum I had already calculated down to the penny. And fourth, their lawyers would draft a new, legally binding covenant, to be filed with the county and attached to my deed in perpetuity, permanently exempting my ranch from any and all HOA oversight, rules, or regulations, past, present, and future. My land would be sovereign territory. Once all those conditions were met and the documents were signed, I would sign over the deed to the 10 by 10 foot plot of land for $1. The toll booth and the sign would be gone the next day. They stared at the paper as if it were a death sentence. They protested, they argued, but they had no leverage. Every day they delayed, another $2,000 flowed from their residents' pockets into my bank account. The community was on the verge of revolt. They had no choice. 2 days later, my lawyer received a call. The HOA had agreed to all my terms. The following week was a whirlwind of satisfying vindication. A formal, groveling apology from Carol Gable was emailed to every resident, followed swiftly by the announcement of her resignation. A check for my legal fees was delivered to my lawyer's office. But the most beautiful sight was the arrival of the construction crew. The same men who had erected the fence now began to tear it down, post by post, under my watchful eye. The steel cage was unmade, and with every section that fell, I felt a weight lift from my soul. The sky over my ranch seemed wider, the air cleaner. My life has since returned to the quiet rhythm I cherish, but it is a different kind of quiet now. It is not the quiet of isolation, but the quiet of earned peace. The gate remains, but it stands permanently open, a monument to the HOA's folly. The new board leaves me completely alone, and the residents of the meadows no longer see me as an eyesore or a relic. When they drive past now, some of them even offer a small, respectful wave. They understand the concept of boundaries in a way they never did before. I dismantled the toll booth, but I kept the sign. It hangs on the wall in my barn, a reminder that you should never underestimate a man defending his home. They thought their power came from their rules, their lawyers, and their steel fences. They never understood that true power lies in knowing your land, knowing your rights, and having the patience to wait for your opponent to make one critical, arrogant mistake. In the end, they learned the hard way that you cannot wall off a man's world without first making sure you're not standing on his property when you do it.